In this tutorial, we'll cover how to use Burp Proxy interception rules and all of the associated options. Burp Proxy is the tool that you can use to intercept, view, and modify all the traffic passing between your browser and the application you're testing. So to see how that works, I'm just going to open Burp's embedded browser and visit a URL. So when I do that, the requests come through in the proxy intercept view in Burp so that you can view, modify, and forward them. If you're testing a modern application, this can result in a large number of requests and responses, and it can become a bit too much to intercept and view them all and keep having to click forward. So you can use Burp's interception rules to control exactly what gets intercepted. We do that in the proxy tool in the options tab, these settings for intercept client requests and intercept server responses. So to intercept anything, you need to check the box in each section. So by default, requests are intercepted. By default, responses are not intercepted. And you also need to have your master interception toggle on, otherwise everything will get passed through automatically. You can define multiple rules to determine what gets intercepted. So each of these rules can be individually toggled to enable or disable it. So you can have rules set up that you might use from time to time. You don't have to have them enabled all the time. The enabled rules are processed in order from top to bottom, and the results are combined using Boolean operators. And this is a simple left to right logic with no configurable scope. By default, for requests, Burp will intercept requests whose file extension does not match a list of fairly boring common file extensions for images, style sheets, scripts, and other things. In general, you're less interested in those page resources when you're working. There are some other rules that are there by default but are not enabled. So you can say that you will intercept any request containing parameters, or if the HTTP method does not match the usual get or post, you can enable interception only of items that are in your target scope. For responses, the default rule, if you enable response interception, is that only responses where the content type header contains the word text will be intercepted. And there are some other rules which you can use for common purposes. So if you want to always intercept a response when you modified or intercepted the request, you can enable these rules. You can ignore all responses with a 304 status code. 304 status code means to use a local cached copy, and this is generally quite a boring response. And again, you can configure only to intercept responses that are in your target scope. If you create an interception rule, the way it works is you define the Boolean operator that will be used to combine it with preceding rules, and then you pick the attribute that you want to set a rule for. So for requests, you have a whole list of different attributes like domain, IP address, the protocol, method, URL, all these sorts of things. You can define a rule whether to match on them, and you can define does match or does not match depending on whether you want to intercept. The match condition can be a regular expression, so you've got real flexibility in what kind of items you match on. So to see how this works, I'm going to turn interception back on, and I'm going to browse a bit around the PortSwigger website. And as we do this, you'll see that lots of requests happen. Some of them are requests for PortSwigger.net, and some of them are for other domains like Google Analytics that we're not as interested in. So what I'm going to do is create an interception rule that ignores anything that isn't on the PortSwigger.net domain. So I'll create a rule and use the AND operator and say I want to match on the domain name, and I just want to intercept items that are on the PortSwigger.net domain. I've defined that rule. It gets enabled by default. If I now go back to interception and browse around a bit more, you will see that those requests no longer get intercepted. So now that we've narrowed down interception just to the domain that we're interested in, you'll see that quite often as you browse around, you see requests for items that you actually aren't completely interested in, even if they're on the same domain. So here we can see we get lots of requests for this bundles URL that contains a lot of JavaScript bundles that we maybe are not interested in intercepting all the time. So the way we can deal with that is we can add another interception rule, and we can say I'm going to match on the URL, and I want URLs that do not match that URL prefix. So if I define this rule, enables it by default. If I then browse around some more, we can see that requests are intercepted for the web security URL, but not for that bundle's URL, even though those requests are still happening in the background. Now, there's another way that we can use interception rules to achieve this same thing. So I've defined individual rules for the domain name and the URL. A different way to do that is to use target scope. So I'm just going to disable those two rules so they're no longer applicable. And I'm going to go in the sitemap and I'm going to add PortSwigger to scope. And I'm going to exclude the bundle's URL from scope. So if we look at the scope definition, we can see that PortSwigger.net is in scope and that bundle's URL prefix is out of scope. So what we can now do in our proxy options is we can enable this interception rule that was there but disabled by default to say that we'll only intercept items when the URL is in target scope. So if we now browse around some more, we can see this is working. We get requests for the right URL path and we don't get anything else. For response interception rules, there are a few additional options that don't apply to requests. So we can define rules based on whether the request was intercepted or was modified or was annotated in our proxy testing workflow. We can intercept based on the status code or the content type header or the MIME type or the page title. So to see how response interception rules work, I'm going to create a rule that says I will intercept responses only if the request was modified. And I'm going to turn on interception responses. So if we browse around some more, we will see that requests are being intercepted in the normal way, but no responses. And if we edit one of these requests, we then see that the response gets stalled for interception because it matched on the rule to say that the request had been modified. And when you're working in the interception view of Burp, there are some nice helper functions that can speed up your work. Using the context menu or using the action menu at the top, we have some options to define interception rules. So we can, on any particular intercepted request, we can say, don't intercept requests to this host, IP address, file extension or directory. Or if we want, we can say, do intercept just the response to this one request, and that will override any of the interception rules that you've got configured. So that's how to use Burp Proxy interception rules and all of the associated options.